for joining us this morning. With the settings and whatnot, you can please feel free to turn off the mics and cameras. It's just ourselves that need that facility at the moment. But if you do want to ask anything at any stage, if you want to raise your hand, then you can enable them then and there. You will have noticed when you were admitted as well that it says that the session is being recorded. So if anybody doesn't want to be recorded for whatever reasons, I won't ask what those are, then just to let you know that is going to be shared at a later date. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us at the moment, and just give it as to the session that we're holding, and then hand over to Becky so she can take it forward. Really, I've just got a couple more joining now.
Are my slides looking okay? I can't see from my screen how it's.
Yeah, I can see them just fine. They're coming up. They've got the bar, so it's not kind of on the present view. But having said that, you can see them. So
that's fine, as long as you can see them, because I'm doing something clever with presenter notes behind the screens, which I don't want you to see.
All right, okay, no worries. That's fine. I mean, we've got the vast majority of people on here now that were going to be joining us. So if you'd like to go ahead, Becky. I mean, just from any UPC's point of view, we wanted to put this session forward on a national level because we had engagement with Becky and her team previously around what Chancery Lane offers in terms of the clauses and the focus on sustainability and net zero in particular. So it was a session that we had locally, and I have taken on board, and I'll touch on later how that incorporated into a recent tender that I'd done. But we felt it'd be sensible to open it up more nationally because it is open to everybody to use. It's a resource there that's free to access and what have you. And we just felt that we'd open it up to the whole of UKUPC and get a bit more coverage for them, but also to make people aware. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Becky, and I'll be hovering in the background as and when required.
Oh, that's amazing. Thanks ever so much. Matt, and thank you everybody for inviting me to come along and talk today. I hope that what I say is going to be useful. The presentation that I've got for you is delivering net zero in supply chain contracts. But before I get into that, I'll probably just explain who I am and why I'm interested in supply chain contracts. I'm Becky Anderson. I'm currently the Director of Engagement at the Chancery Lane Project, and I'll explain in a little bit who they are, who we are and what we do. But to give you some context, before I became Director of Engagement at TCLP, I was an in-house lawyer for 12 years at a pretty large multinational company. And while I was there, I specialised in commercial contracting and particularly I specialise in outsourcing. So it's very much my spiritual home, and which is why I'm really, really pleased to be presenting to you here today. I'm going to explain a little bit about the concept behind our organisation, tell you who we are, what we do. Then I'm going to take you through some of our resources. All of our resources are freely available. We are a philanthropically funded non-profit, so all of the materials and the training that we produce is all done for free. And really the only ask that we have of people is if you see a clause or a piece of information which is useful to you, please go out and use it to cut your carbon. Matt has also very kindly said that towards the end, he's going to talk a little bit about how he has already started using some of our materials. And I've got some case studies for you. And in particular, towards the end of the talk, I'll be going through what I like to think of as the sort of a series of steps and actions specifically aimed at supply chains, where it's not just about using our clauses, but it's about positioning everything so that those clauses are successful in reducing carbon. And that will come towards the end. And I'm very happy to share these slides as well. The first thing that I really wanted to talk to you about is the idea of using contracts. It's the idea of delivering net zero in supply chain, but specifically supply chain contracts. And the reason that this is such an important part of our mission at the Chancery Lane Project is because we don't really have very much time to fix climate change. According to the IPCC report, we have, I think, until 2030 to really embed all the things that we need to do to fix climate change before we have baked in a certain level of temperature rise which cannot be undone and which will be catastrophic if the report makes some pretty sobering reading. I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with it. And our view is that whilst regulation is really important, it's an amazing levelling of the playing field, it's also really slow. We have known about climate crisis for a very long time. It's been an incredibly long time also since we've signed the Paris Agreement globally, but we have no regulation that fully gives effect to Paris in any country anywhere in the world. So regulation is powerful, but it's moving too slowly for our needs. Litigation, again, there's an awful amount of climate change cases in the works. That really famous one in May 2021 in the Dutch courts, where Shell were told to cut their emissions by 45%. These are also incredibly important for accountability. They form a significant risk for companies, but the carbon has been emitted. And again, the litigation itself is quite slow. It's taking 7 or 8 years to get some of these cases through. And we've only got between now and 2030. In between the two poles, if you like, of regulation and litigation sits contracts and all of the quasi-legal work and quasi-contractual work and procurement work that goes into supporting businesses doing their day jobs. And we think that that is where there is a really, really big opportunity to make a significant amount of change without having to wait for regulation or litigation to force it. And this has a number of other advantages, as well as being fast. Contracts, obviously, much faster than the alternatives, but they're also really bespoke. You can make a contract and you can put carbon reducing clauses in your contract, which are really specific to your industry, your sector, your specific need on that specific day. Contracting as a mechanism is super familiar. When I talk to you about some of the clauses that we have that are available to be used, they will seem familiar. They will be termination rights, and there will be gain share mechanisms, and there will be liquidated damages, and there will be recitals and clauses to go in non-disclosure agreements. There is nothing particularly weird or wonderful here. All we're doing is saying, if you've set a net zero target, you can take that voluntary target and turn it into a legally enforceable contractual term in the same way that you do for price, service spec, delivery times. And what I say to people is, you know, if you were a company, your shareholders would be pretty unimpressed if you didn't put pricing into the contracts and just left it as kind of a voluntary, we'll try and do that. We need to start applying that thinking to carbon. And so contracts give you a very clear means to deliver on climate goals. They give a legally enforceable means to do it. And that's the starting point of the Chancery Lane Project. And what we did once our founder, Matt, had this brainwave, we went out to the legal profession and we said, okay, we've got this idea, but it's going to be really hard for people to draft clauses from a standing start. So let's give them a head start. And we arranged these, what we call legal hackathons, where we got hundreds of lawyers in a room to draft the very first contract playbook. And I remember very clearly, because I was a volunteer at that time, I remember I was sitting opposite the table from somebody from one of the top tier law firms in the UK who worked in their oil and gas division. And I was sitting across the table from someone who had an Extinction Rebellion patch sewn on their rucksack, who was also a lawyer. And between us, we were all coming up with ideas for contract clauses to fix this. So it was an incredible coming together collaboration of the legal profession, which was just amazing, really. And it's been an overwhelming success. We have now got over 120 clauses, we've got materials, we've got toolkits, we've got training videos, all of these sorts of things. And the really tough work starts now, because the tough work now, all of this material is there and it's drafted, is persuading people to put it into their contracts. And that's basically sort of my job. And again, I just wanted to kind of bring everybody's minds and focus back to that deadline that I mentioned at the start, that we have until 2030 to hit the IPCC deadlines. And that's true even if your organisation has set a net zero target, for example, of 2050. You still really have until 2030 to do the bulk of the work. And I think that's really important in two. I'm going to express that figure in two different ways to people. And the first way that I express it to people is that's probably at this point about 81, maybe 80 board meetings. Now, if anybody knows anything about board meetings and how hard it is to get things on the agenda and things like that, that's not a lot of time to get things agreed and sorted out at a board level. But that's also years off your contracting. So every contract you sign today that doesn't have carbon reducing clauses in, that you won't be able to put them in that contract. I mean, you can renegotiate contracts, but it's really hard and nobody really does it. That contract, if that was a 3-year contract or a 5-year contract, that's now 3 or 5 years off your timeline because you can't touch that contract again until it renews. And so that's why I kind of want to say to people, it's not about what gets done in 2030 or what gets done in 2050, it's what gets done now. Because if you sign a big contract now, which is 5 years plus 2, then that is just taking time off the small amount of time we have left to get it done. But it's still the faster option. So that's kind of my intro. As I mentioned, the Chancery Lane Project, we are a non-profit pro bono organisation. We bring together lawyers to draft, peer review, and then we publish contract clauses and other materials for tackling the climate crisis. Our community has over 2,300 professionals, and that includes a mix of lawyers, procurement professionals, sustainability professionals, C-suite, as a really big mix of individuals there. We've got over 300 participating organisations, including every single one of the top 25 law firms in the UK and a quarter of the global elite law firms. And the work we do is essentially in 2 different work streams. We do these collaborative drafting events. We do less of them now because we have 120 clauses. So now we're much more targeted towards gap filling our existing set of clauses. But with 120, there's usually something there for everybody. And then I go out and I persuade people to use our solutions. And we're constantly reevaluating those clauses, tweaking them, putting new guidance and information out, because every day we're learning something new about the climate science or about the way the clauses are working in practice and how they need to be tweaked. And what a lot of this presentation is going to be in the end is going to be a sort of a bringing together of some of those practical tips that I have had from corporates, from government agencies like the Environment Agency on how best to make good use of them. And just to reiterate, everything we do is free because we're funded by grant money. I've got a few core values that I will rattle through very quickly. We're an independent organisation. We don't belong to a particular professional body. We're not affiliated with a single law firm. We are politically neutral, although I personally always add the caveat that we are lucky in the UK that climate change is a fairly politically neutral thing. And I'm aware as we move into international spaces that isn't necessarily true in other jurisdictions. We're really, really interested in making a safe space to innovate. I think it's very hard for lawyers to draft well in advance of legislation, which is effectively what we're asking them to do. So we make sure our drafting is published in a way that's unattributable to individuals so that they feel free to innovate and be really creative. All of our clauses and content is free to use, and more importantly, not just free to use, it's free for you to adapt as you see fit. That's what I mentioned at the beginning about we think that contracts are really important because they offer something which is really bespoke. I'm an ex-lawyer. I would never just take a set of drafting and put it into a contract without tweaking it and amending it to get it just perfect for my client. And we fully expect that everybody else who's using our clauses is going to do the same. And lastly, we are really interested in making this a collaborative space. Climate change is a multidisciplinary problem. We are going to need a multidisciplinary solution, and the best solutions and our best clauses are ones that cross-fertilise across industry sectors and across legal practice areas. So as I mentioned several times, we've got 120 climate clauses on our website, and the Net Zero Toolkit, which is a toolkit specifically for helping you get your organisation and your contracts, your existing contracts, giving a health check to them and seeing how close they are to helping you get to net zero. I think one of the things that's been a surprise hit and a surprise success in our work is the glossary of terms. We have a very large glossary of terms. If you come across a climate phrase, a climate term, whether it's scope 3 or net zero or race to zero or greenhouse gas emissions, we almost certainly have a glossary term for that. And the glossary terms are drafted in a way that they can be lifted up and put into a contract as a standard definition in that contract. And they have been hugely successful. I think I've mentioned that each of our clauses, and including each of our glossary terms, has been through a rigorous peer review process. In asking people to draft things well in advance of legislation, we wanted to make sure that they were doing a really good job of it. And so each one of our clauses has been sent out to sector or industry or legal experts to say, this is the clause that our volunteers came up with. Does that look like good law to you? Does that look practical to you? And that was a really important part of our work. And as I've mentioned many times, these are a starting point for you to change your contracts, make them bespoke. We don't expect anybody to just pick them up and use them as they are. So next, again, this is just to give you an idea. This is not all of our clauses, but this is to give you an idea of the breadth of our clauses. It just breaks down a few of them across what I would call the legal life cycle, from corporate governance through due diligence, procurement, and all the way out the other side to breach and dispute resolutions. And the other thing I think that is going to be important, there's just two things I'm going to mention here, actually. As you're looking at this slide, you will notice that each of our clauses has a human name: Mary's clause, Luna's clause, Raphael's due diligence questionnaire. And that is because that they are named after the children who are important to the people who drafted them. And it's our look towards the future, really. So that's the first thing, just to kind of explain why there's human names all over this slide. And the second thing that I think is really important to note and understand about our clauses is that they deliberately span a wide range of climate ambition. So there are absolutely clauses on here which will not take carbon out. They just won't. They're not designed to take carbon out. We have something called Eddie's recitals. Doesn't take any carbon out. It sits in the recitals section of your contract, just that background section, really. It's not a legally enforceable term, and all it says is the parties agree that the Paris Agreement is a real and important thing, and they have set net zero targets in alignment with the Paris Agreement and then you would put your net zero targets in. And it doesn't require anybody to actually meet those targets or do anything to reduce the carbon in the agreement. And we've got a number of clauses that sit in that space. And the reason they're important is that we want to meet people where they are. Not everybody is ready to put a fully Paris-aligned, best-in-class, dark green clause straight in their contracts. And frankly, if they did, it would almost certainly fail without doing a lot of preparatory work. And I'll talk about that preparatory work on the next slide. But so what we do expect people to do, though, is to constantly look at where they are on the ladder of ambition and how they can move up that ladder. So that's why we have these light green clauses, light green, low ambition clauses. That recitals clause is not going to take any carbon out, but it is going to do several other things. The first thing it's going to do is to start to socialise the idea of putting these types of clauses into your contracts, getting people used to more specific language. So I remember from back in the day when I was an outsourcing lawyer, we would frequently have clauses in our contracts and see clauses in other people's contracts that would say things like, you will comply with our sustainability policy. And the problem with that is that, by and large, that sustainability policy has been drafted not in terms of legally enforceable obligations and has been drafted as a wholly internal facing document. And yet it is referred to in the head agreement and kind of gets pulled into the head agreement, but in language and in terms which don't necessarily really work. So the idea of using our clauses instead is that you are gradually getting much, much more specific. Instead of saying sustainability policy, go and look at it, it's over there. And then you get there and it's things like our staff will try and remember to turn off their computers when they go home at night, which doesn't really get you where you need to be. By starting to put something like Eddie's recitals in, suddenly you're getting something which is specifically aimed at that agreement, specifically drafted, and you're starting to really socialize people that you are on a journey now which will end up with full-on decarbonisation clauses that have bite. And what do I mean when I say bite? And it comes down to that legal enforcement piece. You know, if you put a critical delivery schedule in a contract and your supplier consistently fails to meet it, then you're not just going to throw up your hands and say, oh, well, there's nothing we could do about that. You're going to start looking at your service credits regime, your step-in rights. You're going to start looking at liquidated damages. And if push really comes to shove, you might start looking at your termination rights. And that's what I mean here, is that we're trying to kind of move people's minds to the point where you're not just applying that to your delivery schedule, you're not just applying that to your service spec, you're applying that sort of bite if they fail to meet the carbon delivery piece. And one thing I'll come on to in the case studies is how that's also been flipped from pure stick, a pure stick approach of termination rights, liquidated damages, and other people are using gain share and reward based approaches on the back of our clauses as well in industries where the stick just doesn't work. But I'll leave discussion of that until the case study bit because I think it sits more naturally there. So getting back to the low light green versus dark high ambition. It's also about, so firstly I've talked about how it's about socializing people, and it's about setting the stage, putting the first rung or first foot on the rung of the ladder. And there's one of the things I think is really good here is that some of our light green clauses can be used in those sort of pre-contractual documents. So we have a heads of terms clause, which talks about climate being on the kind of the list of things that you are going to be negotiating, and that being expressed in terms of the Paris Agreement or a net zero goal, something very specific. We have a non-disclosure agreement clause that you can put in your non-disclosure agreement, which is again getting people used to the idea that all the way through your contracting pipeline, from heads of terms, which is non-legally binding, to pre-contractual documents like non-disclosure agreements, you're gradually stacking things up. So when you do start to put much more Paris-aligned operative terms in your head agreement, you have suppliers who are ready for it. They know it's coming because they've seen it in the heads of terms. They've seen it in the non-disclosure agreement where they've had the opportunity to ask questions about it. So when it starts popping up later, it's not a surprise. You can then take these increasingly more ambitious clauses until you are implementing fully Paris-aligned climate clauses. So one of our fully aligned Paris-aligned climate clauses is Owen's clause. And I'm just going to give you the headlines on what Owen's clause does. So the first thing Owen's clause does is that it requires your suppliers to align their net zero target with your own. Then it sets a climate emissions target or a carbon emissions target, which is a proportion of your own net zero target, but it sets it on a per contractual basis. So this contract to deliver these services has a carbon footprint target of X. The next thing the clause does is say, well, in order to meet the IPCC requirements, that carbon footprint target is going to have to reduce by, say, 7% for every year that the contract is running. So it is a constantly reducing target. So people are constantly trying to get better and do better year on year. And then the last thing it says is if that supplier fails to hit that target at any point, you know, maybe they hit it in year 1, but they don't manage to hit it in year 3, then you will have two options. You can terminate them because they have breached a major term of the contract. Although, let's be honest, I've worked in outsourcing. If you have a supplier who is delivering you the goods you want to the service spec, to the specification you want, on the timescales you want, and for a price you like, and they're consistently doing that, you're never going to terminate them because they missed carbon footprint targets. We're just not there yet in the market for that. But what this clause also does is say, okay, so you don't want to terminate them. Excuse me. You don't want to terminate them. What we're going to do instead is we're going to set liquidated damages, and those liquidated damages will be the cost, or what it costs you to buy carbon offsets for the amount of carbon they missed that carbon target by. And then you have to spend that money on buying the offsets. So you don't get to make a profit on the carbon emission. You don't get to make a profit on the fact that they missed the carbon target. That money has to be spent on trying to make the situation better than it was. But we always say reduction first, offset second, because the world of offsets is quite a murky one. We've actually got a whole paper on offsets themselves. I'm pretty sure there was an article in either Guardian or the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago showing that some major offsetting schemes, some major rainforest-based offsetting schemes, were not doing anything in terms of carbon at all. So that's why we always put offsets second, because the offset market it's just not quite there yet. One of the other things I would say is, just maybe to preempt a question at the end, is that when I introduce Owen's clause in particular, I almost always have somebody say, gosh, that sounds really off market, and really quite painful. We're never going to get anybody to agree to that. And I do have some sympathy with that view. Although I have slightly less sympathy with that view as time goes on, and I'm going to explain why. I think the first thing I always say to people is, Owen's clause is a Paris-aligned clause. I think up until now, it's been quite hard to take something which feels as far away and as abstract as the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees by 2050. And that feels quite abstract when you're dealing with the day-to-day of, I've got to get this service spec out. I've got to make sure these goods are delivered on time. That feels quite abstract in that space. And what clauses like Owen's clause do is they take that really abstract Paris Agreement and say, okay, well, what does it mean on a contract by contract basis? What does it mean in black and white drafting? And then it shows you. And I think that this is really important and really powerful, because when people come to me and say, that's not market, I say, that's aligned with the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is aimed at making sure we continue to have a livable world. If the market isn't aligned with the Paris Agreement, what do we need to do, and on what timescale to get it aligned? Because, and I know this is a cliche you've probably heard before, but there is no profit on a dead planet. There is no point to any of this if in 40 years there's no world left, for humans to reasonably inhabit. So if we say this isn't market and I can't get in a contract, what do we need to do, and on what timescale to get it into a contract to make sure we hit 1.5 in 2050? So that's the first thing I always say to people. And the second thing I always say is, I don't think the market is actually as far away as people think. I think when they say that's off market, where they mean one of two things. They mean, I don't want to pay the extra it might cost to do that. Or they mean, I have a supply chain who are not sophisticated enough to deliver that. And that's not quite the same thing as, well, that's just off market, because those are, once you start to express it in terms of, I don't want to pay for it, or I don't have a supply chain who can do that, then we can really start to dig into how do we fix those problems. Because you might not want to pay for it, but it might be that using circular economy principles, you can find savings in other spaces. It might be that you don't have a supply chain who are sophisticated enough to deliver that. So what training do you need to put in place? What research, what solutions do you need to be looking at in order to get yourself to a point where you've got a supply chain who can do it? So that's why I always encourage people to really, really dig into that it's not market assumption. And the other thing is that 4 of the case studies that I'm going to be describing later use that clause successfully, with, to my great surprise as an ex-outsourcing lawyer, very little complaint and kickback from their supply chains because of the way that they implemented it. And I'm going to talk to you about how they implemented and how they did that. But all of it comes back down to something I said earlier on, which is if you took Owen's clause today, fantastic, high ambition, Paris-aligned clause, and put it straight into a supply chain contract and sent it out today, even if somebody signed it, crossing their fingers behind their back that they would be able to deliver that, but sort of knowing that they couldn't, it's not going to be a success because they won't be able to deliver it. The carbon's not going to come out. You're not going to get rid of them because they're delivering on all of the other stuff. And ultimately, what we want is for these clauses to go into contracts and be a success. And that means take the carbon out in line with the timescales that you need them to hit your net zero targets. So how do we do that? How do we do that bit? And that is my next slide. And I like to call it stacking the deck. I think there are sort of 5 stages really before you get to the contract terms that you can see right at the end of my list. I think there's 5 stages that we need to go through as organisations so that when Owen's clause goes into that contract term, the ultimate outcome is not you hit the liquidated damages or you agonise over whether to use the termination clause. It's that the carbon comes out on the timescales that you need. So what do we do to stack the deck? And what resources do the Chancery Lane Project have at each stage of stacking the deck to help you do it? So the first one is, I always like to start with corporate governance at the board level. So when I worked in-house, we had something called the Major Projects Committee. If a transaction, and that could include significant supplier transactions, if they were big enough or if the spend was enough or if they were mission critical enough, if a significant transaction hit a certain threshold, then it would have to go to the Major Projects Committee for a risk review. And, you know, as a lawyer, I was involved in contributing various different sections to this risk review. But what the risk review never did was looked at the carbon footprint of the deal. And that's what Griff's clause does. And that's what I encourage people to do at this corporate governance level, is that when you are reviewing significant transactions or significant supplier spend as a part of your normal processes because of the risk review you might be doing, you need to be calculating what the estimated carbon footprint of that is. And you need to be doing it at the corporate governance level because that's the level at which somebody's going to be able to say, somebody in the C-suite or somebody with decision-making authority is going to be able to say, okay, we know that we've got our net zero target. We know that this contract is materially going to bust through that target for the next 5 years because of the carbon that's locked up in it. So I will say that this contract is so important, we will bust through the target, but that will mean that these other contracts over there, they have to do better on their carbon targets. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit from the carbon targets of these other contracts where we think we can do a bit better, add them to the carbon target of this really significant one, and we'll call that good. Or they might be able to say, okay, well, we're going to need to increase the price that we're willing to pay in order to make sure that we can get that carbon target down. But the reason I'm so keen with having that decision-making taken at the corporate governance level is because I've been in those calls, not on necessarily carbon, but on other risk factors, where everything has been stalled in a contract negotiation because we had to go back up to the main board to get approval on some weird and wonderful insurance provision or something. And it just makes the whole process longer. And that kind of offsetting, by which I mean that kind of trading, will accept a higher carbon target on these contracts because we know we can make it up on these contracts, or we'll make a fund available under this contract to help any suppliers upskill their people and slightly change their systems to make them more carbon proof going forward. That's the sort of thing that needs to be done at that level. And Griff's board minutes are available as a template to help you get that done. So getting that sort of buy-in baked in at the corporate level, then we kind of calm down a level. And then I would say the next thing is about engagement and education. One of the things that's in our case studies, and we also have a 10-minute training video that just explains net zero to people. That's another resource for you. I would say If your suppliers don't understand any of this stuff, then they're going to come unstuck. If you're in a large organisation which is rolling out training for your own people, invite your suppliers to attend the training. In the age of webinar, it doesn't really sort of cost you any more money. And then you will know that your suppliers are trained to the same level as your staff. Engagement, again, is an important piece here. The most successful case studies all held stakeholder engagement meetings with their suppliers. They said, what solutions would you put in place? How would you make that happen? Would you need extra resource to do it? Have those conversations outside of the deal that you're trying to do. Because once you've got a set of contract terms in place, it's really hard to think outside that and say, well, what if? So treat your suppliers like stakeholders. They might well have solutions that you had never thought of, but what that will do is it will signal to them that this is coming down the line and will eventually end up in the contract terms. And that's a good thing, because what you don't want is when those contracts terms hit and Owen's clauses in there, you don't want some lawyer like me just putting a red line through the clause because it looks weird, it looks unfamiliar, you're worried that your team haven't priced for it and you don't understand what it does. So you can avoid that with early engagement and early education. Next is due diligence, very familiar to all of you, and I know that Matt's going to pick up on this really critical piece in a moment. But due diligence will do a number of things for you, as I'm sure you're aware. It will help you find out the suppliers that can do it and the suppliers that can't. It will help you find where you've got really important SMEs that you need to support and coach and give education to and bring on that journey. It will also tell you where you have critical suppliers who are so far behind on their understanding of this that I would be worried that they would be a critical risk to your operation. And what I mean by that is, if you have a supplier who shows no interest at all in understanding any of these things, how do you know that their own warehouses are not all sitting on floodplains and are going to be out of action for 2 weeks when we have the physical effects of climate change and a massive flood in a particular area? So that's what I always say to people, is that your suppliers, when they answer these questions, they're not only showing you what they can do for you in terms of net zero, but they're also showing you where you have a potential exposed risk, because they don't understand the risks to their own business and their own supply chains. I've mentioned already pre-contractual documents. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. We have heads of terms, non-disclosure agreements. Is going to get people thinking in the right direction and getting them prepared to see it in the main contract. Oh, I skipped over tender. I'm so sorry. Tender. One of the things that I've been hearing from people in the market, which I think is super interesting, is getting people to tender on carbon footprint as well as on price and solution. And then you can not only compare like for like, but when you want to put that carbon footprint as your starting number in Owen's clause in the contract, you should have no complaints from the supplier who put it in there in the first place. And that's kind of everything on my list. That should take you all the way up to Owen's clause and hopefully making Owen's clause a really big success. These are some of the case studies we've got available. They're all available on our website for you to look at your leisure. I think that we've got a couple more. I think we've got a new one that's just come out and a couple more in the pipeline. So if you haven't signed up to our mailing list, then please do so, because they'll all be published through the mailing list and you'll get kind of heads up on workshops and new case studies and new clauses as soon as they come out. The UK Environment Agency is one that I'm going to highlight for you in particular. They work in a very low margin industry. I had no idea, but one of the main things the UK Environment Agency does is construction work because of flood defences. Construction work is traditionally incredibly low margin. I used to work for a construction company, so I know only too well and too painfully how low margin it can be. But they said, we'll never get a liquidated damages clause to stick because the margins in the industry are so low across the board. No one's going to be able to deal with that. So instead, they put in a reward-based mechanism. So they took Owen's clause, and instead of liquidated damages, they said, if you beat the carbon footprint target, you will get a payout. you will get a bump in the pricing. And that has, I believe, the first payouts of those happened last year, and that it went off very successfully. So just to kind of say, bespoke it, some industries you'll need to flip it and turn it into a reward. NatWest are using our supply chain clauses in 140 of their supply chain precedents. So every time a NatWest takes a supply chain contract and signs it, it now has TCLP clauses in, and that includes a variant or another version of Owen's clause again. Salesforce have been using our clauses for, I think it's going to be 2 years in April now, with their sustainability exhibit, which was very well received amongst their supply chain. In particular, Salesforce did a huge, Salesforce, the Environment Agency, and NatWest and Vodafone all did huge amounts of stakeholder workshops with their suppliers. And I had conversations with people from all of those organisations. All of them were surprised at how well received it was, how the suppliers did not really kick back on the terms in the way that they were expecting, or to the level that they were expecting. And I believe it's because they did such great work on education and stakeholder engagement in the early days. And I also highlight Vodafone. I think they're very interesting because they have ended up with kind of a 2-tier system where they have one set of due diligence questions and one set of kind of benchmarks and requirements for SMEs and one for larger corporates, with the idea that they're giving the SMEs more time, more space to get up to the same level that they expect the larger corporates to be operating at now. And I think that's a good way, if you've got a lot of SMEs in your supply chain, to how you can balance that. Because one of the very legitimate things that people have come back and said about our clauses is an SME is never going to be able to cope with that. Now, I think that's not necessarily true of all SMEs, but I think this is absolutely a space where we can be looking to say, how can we nurture and help SMEs be competitive in this space? And that's the main chunk of my section over. Please email me. I love talking to people. Please email me any comments or questions or queries you have. And then I'm going to just flip over to Matt now, if that's okay, Matt, for you to kind of talk a bit about what you've done with our clauses. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end.
Yeah, most certainly. Thank you very much for that, Becky. It's a really good broad overview. I mean, I realise there's an awful lot to look at, and I found that myself when I came to look at the site in terms of how much is there, the amount of resources there. It's fantastic, and it's the important thing is it's almost understanding the level at which you're looking to pitch at. First off, so for myself, it was Raphael's checklist that I was using, and that very quickly enabled, because doing something at framework level, each institution for an individual contract with a supplier is going to have slightly different goals or focuses or what have you. So from a framework level, I wanted to just do some due diligence around, as you said, as you touched upon, how seriously some of these supplier institutions are actually taking this and how far along they are. And to be quite honest with you, it's quite an eye-opener when you get the answers back, because it's human nature to presume in certain instances, and it's quite surprising how some of the organizations that you would expect to be far more advanced in this area really aren't as much so. And the thing is that I liked about it is you can quickly see, you've got a differentiator, so you can see people's scores differ, and so when that comes to kind of a further competition, or it can be, we use the technique there where there's kind of desktop calculator where you can change weightings according to what's important to you. So obviously if you have very stringent targets around sustainability institution wise, it may be that the weighting that we gave it at framework level, it wasn't high enough for what you wanted, so you can change that accordingly. But that will potentially give you a different answer in terms of the sustainability element of it, changing the weighting in terms of importance as to how that would mean that the suppliers then rank. As I said, I included in there, I didn't take them all, but I just included, I think there were 10 questions overall, but it was really good in terms of giving me something tangible that I could score somebody on. So it was just to give you examples of the types of ones that I was looking at in terms of, do you have a net zero target in place? Is it a science-based target? Does the facility itself have a green building program to work towards BREEAM? So it's not just focusing on one area, it's the organization as a whole in terms of premises, in terms of staffing, production methods, all these different kinds of things to focus on. So at framework level, that was really useful to do because it gives you a starting point and a differentiator of the quality of the suppliers as how far along they're likely to be in their journey if some of these things aren't being considered already at this stage. But in terms of being able to embellish upon those, some of the contractual clauses, I mean, I remember when we spoke about it initially, Becky, the T's and C's from our point of view had just been settled upon for this exercise. So it was too late to include any of them in mind. But certainly going forward, if there are some in there, and again, it has to be ones that can be agreed across the board that everybody would be happy with at a framework level, certainly. To include those clauses in there as an expectation from consortia to supplier, but also then if members wish to include more clauses locally around that, then that can be between an institution and supplier. So the local expectation may well be either more stringent or more focused than the higher level that the framework operates at. But I think that was the key thing in terms of a lot of people on here listening today are from member institutions, and it's a case of when they're doing their supplier management internally in line with their own expectations and also in line with their own targets, how they can then use some of these clauses to have something there legally. I mean, as you said before, the mechanism to ensure that these things were being delivered, it was difficult to implement in terms of, first of all, what values do you put on it and where do you set the bar? But then equally, what recourse do you have to go back to them and say, well, actually, you haven't met this, and therefore this is the consequence. And that's where the legal clause came into it. So I really like the idea of some of the clauses. I mean, as you said, there's some of those on there that are so deep green that it would probably, and realistically, that would take an awful lot of resource from our end to manage in terms of making sure that people were delivering what they'd said. But equally, there are very much some of them in there that are quick wins, and it's striking that balance between how resource intensive it is from our end versus the benefit we get out. But it's quite right that the deep green ones are there, because if you've got somebody who has a team that focus purely around sustainability, such as some of the big multinationals. I mean, some of those organizations you had on there from case studies, they have big teams to handle this, and they will absolutely need those. So it's great that you've got kind of the light touch element of it all the way up to, very deeply litigant contractual elements as well. So from my point of view, it's reassuring that I've been able to use that first step in a tender exercise and seen how it's given a differentiation between suppliers, because before, some of the questions that we could use, and it was simply down to not being able to phrase questions in the way that we might like, or to be able to put accurate enough parameters in there to say, to get a clear differentiation. Whereas now we can actually see a scored difference, and some of them are quite marked. So it's a good first step, and I think it's certainly something to look at going forward in terms of how we can potentially incorporate some of these things from a terms and conditions point of view going forward in terms of the clauses, rather than just the higher level due diligence as well. But that was my story of having used them.
And I'd also say, I think that you're right that where you have a team who's doing that monitoring and review piece, such as say NatWest, you're in a very different situation. And my hope is that I don't think we're too far off now there being some really, really good, pretty cheap automated solutions on the market for a lot of this. I think people are now starting to coalesce around this as a problem, and a lot of people are tackling it. So I see this could be something where in 2 or 3 years, I don't think it is going to be as resource intensive on people as it is now.
And that's the thing, isn't it? As these things develop and come to market and what have you, it may be that people will adopt more and more of these clauses and take it further and further, because, as you say, if some of the without sounding disrespectful, some of the lower level stuff that you would have to monitor manually now, if that can then be managed on an automated basis, it then gives you the opportunity to say, right, what's the next step and the next. So yeah, it is a gradual process, and we're all at different places in terms of resource and capability as it stands. But it's good to see that when we're ready for those next steps of progression, the clauses are already there to work with, and it's a case of what's coming next and okay, this is where we are. So to implement these, what do we need to do next? So I think it's really encouraging that they're already there. I mean, as I said, when we'd first spoken, Becky, I took some time out to just go through some of the clauses and what have you, just to see, and I could see some real value in them just from a very early stage of thinking, yeah, we could possibly incorporate that, because where terms before haven't been able to kind of pin somebody down and say, well, this is the result. I mean, as you were saying there with the Environment Agency working in that particular sphere, the reward element of it would be particularly appealing, I feel, because, you know, if they had to take on something where they're already in very tight margins anyway, and then take on the risk of further litigation, it might lead to suppliers not wanting to get involved. Whereas if you've got that reward, it's a case of you're not going to be penalised anymore, but you can get paid more for it by doing the right things at the right time. So I think that would, it's knowing where to apply that in the markets, as you say, where to flip it and where not. But you know, I think the fact that it is flexible like that, according to the area that you're working in, is really encouraging as well.
Are there any? We've got sort of 8 minutes left. Has anybody else got a question?
I haven't seen anything as yet. If anybody wants to put it either in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and I can release the microphones or cameras, whatever, or just appear on camera, whichever you'd like to do, guys. Or if you'd, or if not, if you want to take that away and try and digest some of this stuff and then come back with questions afterwards for me to feed through to Becky and her team. I'm happy to do it either way, whichever way people would like to do it. So we'll have an awkward pause now and see if anybody sticks their head over the parapet or not.
It's a pretty simple one, budget-wise.
Yeah, sure, maybe. Let me just see. I think there's if there's an opportunity to raise your hand, guys. There we go. I can see people doing that now. Okay, so okay, let me just see if I can take this microphone off. Oh, I'm not sure if I can or not. Sorry about that. It's wonderful, isn't it? When because we auto set these things up, and then it's a case of can you override it? And I don't know, but I can try. All else fails, if you want to send on what the question is, or if you want to put it in the chat function, we can maybe pick it up there if that'd be okay.
Great. I've got a question already from Mike. How do we get access to the clauses? It's our website, which I will just go and get our website address and I'll pop it in the chat, and then you can all just get them. So, and there's a section on our website which just says the clauses. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and as I say, they're really easy to access and whatnot. You can just read them in situ, and you can just get them off there at your leisure and stuff like that. So yeah, I would, and that was the thing. It did strike me the first time I went out there. I thought, who are all these people then? But now now we know. I did wonder at first, is it the person that wrote it? But then afterwards, obviously, you explain that. But yeah, it is a nice touch, because as you say, when it's the children and future kind of thing, it's you know, it's the small things, isn't it? So it's quite a nice thing to have anyway. But
I see another question. Can we get support using the clauses? We're a very small team, but if what we can do is if you find a specific clause or a couple of clauses and you just want to ask a few questions about it, then let me know, and we can do that. I think that one of the things that we tried to do in the beginning was to go out and do lots and lots of special implemented training, and we just ended up kind of burning out a bit as a team. But if you've got some sort of really specific query, then please just pop me an email and I'll try and sort something out for you.
Yeah,
although I need to say that we are not we don't give legal advice. I don't hold a current practicing certificate, but what we can do is advise you on what other people have been doing, and we know our clauses very well.
Yeah. And where to use them as well, in terms of where to drop them in document sets and whatnot. I mean, as you say, to draft the whole clauses, obviously that's too much of a pressure for you guys. But equally, if you know where to use them and how to measure them, that would be really useful. Thank you for that. And there's another one here from Coco. It says, in the past you could carry out spot checks on suppliers, but post-COVID, what's the advice on ensuring suppliers are compliant to net zero clauses on the contract?
I think that's a really tough one. I think the market is grappling with that and doesn't have an answer to it. So I don't have any more of an answer than the market does. And I think that it is a combination for some people of self-reporting, which admittedly is not ideal. Some people have more in the way of sort of smart contracting systems set up where they can automatically see carbon levels for various different activities being piped in through a smart contract system. And other people have teams of people going around and checking, which admittedly is hugely labour intensive. But of course, getting the clauses in there means you have the option to go in and do some monitoring. And I would say, you know, if you can build this into monitoring that you're already doing, like if you have contracts where I'm not entirely sure of the sort of breadth of contracts that I'm talking to, but if, for example, you had service level delivery contracts on building maintenance and engineering, how are you checking that they're being done? You know, and if then carbon gets built into the checks that you're already doing a carbon check at the same time, then that might be a way around it. But yeah, I mean, this is absolutely something that people are grappling with generally, I think. Does anybody else on the call have any ideas about doing that?
And again, if there's anything like that, if you want to gather some information from elsewhere and come back, we can share with the group that you're happy to share. I'll share this on more widely as well. We'll have the attendee list so we can share it out to people if you wish to do so. So yeah, that'd be useful. I think that's a bit of a watching brief, Becky, as you say. These there's challenges coming along all the time, and it's a case of how we then deal with them as they arise, I guess. But yeah, I mean, around, and the other thing is as well, as you said, if it's written there is that option, and it only needs to start happening on a handful of occasions, and word soon gets around that people are going to start holding people to this. So, you know, it's just that expectation, and those that can do it that start to, and then it's a case of, oh, you know, this is built in contractually and they do mean it.
I think as well, the market is about to go through a really sudden shift on this in terms of supply chains and outsourcing, because I know just before Christmas, the US government, who is the largest procurer of stuff in the world, they announced that they were putting a new thing in place whereby anybody who supplies to the US government, if your contracts are over $50 million, then you have to report on scopes 1, 2, and 3. If you are between 7.5 and $50 million, you have to report on your scopes 1 and 2, and then there's exemptions for anybody under $7.5 million. But if you think if the American government is going to start getting companies, and there must be a huge amount of people with contracts over $50 million with the US government, particularly on defence and things like that, if they are going to have to start reporting on the scope 3 emissions publicly, because it's public reporting, not just private to the US government, then I would imagine we are going to see an absolute flood of solutions on how to monitor and check and review all of this.
Sure. When that sort of money starts being at stake, then it's amazing how quickly things can move, then, isn't it? Really. So
yeah, I know that they're doing a consultation on it at the moment, but I think that's absolutely one to be watching in the kind of pseudo public procurement space as well.
Of course.
Yeah. Mike, I've just seen. Will you circulate the flowchart of clauses? I'm going to send my slides over to Matt, and so that, if that's okay with you, Matt, so that you can
absolutely.
And the flow chart of clauses will be in there.
Super. Well, that looks like we've timed it absolutely bang on, which is quite nice. Excellent. So that's good to know. But I think from an UPC point of view, and UKUPC indeed, thank you very much for your time, Becky. That sort of insight into what it is that you guys are doing is really useful, and also thank you for the work that's going on as well. You know, we needed somebody to take the bull by the horns, and you guys have done it for better or worse. So thank you for doing that. And also from my point of view, thank you to everybody who's attended this morning. I hope you found it useful. As I said, I'm testament to the fact that you can use these things in anger, and they do make a difference and they do work. So yeah, if anybody wants to get in touch around any of these things, whether it be myself or if you want to get in touch with Becky or both, just give us a shout, and yeah, we can take it from there. But other than that, have a lovely weekend, everybody, and we'll speak to you all soon.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Take care now. Bye.
Bye.